The story begins in Lith, a picturesque and bustling harbor city. A ship had just docked, and the air buzzed with activity. Merchants shouted over each other, advertising their wares, and the streets were alive with a vibrant crowd. An enthusiastic young man stepped off the ship, his orange hair catching the sunlight, and yelled, "I made it! I'm finally here!" He was in awe of how busy and lively the entire city was. His friend, Walker, wrapped an arm around him and grinned. "So, Raymond, are you happy now?" he teased. Before Raymond could answer, a voice from behind chimed in. "Happy? That's it," the voice scoffed. It belonged to Taryn, their blunt companion. He added sarcastically, "Don't go running off from excitement just yet." Looking up at the grand cityscape, Taryn smirked and said, "This is where our adventure begins." This era was known as the Age of Adventures. People from all over the world sought to become heroes by forging their own paths. It was a time of glory and peril, sparked by the appearance of mysterious gates. These portals led to unknown realms filled with horrifying monsters, beasts far beyond anything found in Maple World. Many adventurers lost their lives exploring these realms. Yet, the treasures inside the gates, powerful and priceless items, were enough to tempt even the bravest souls. The scene shifted to the group discussing their strategy for entering a gate. Walker addressed the team with a serious tone. "We'll need bait," he said, his words causing confusion among the others. Walker clarified, "We can't plan properly until we know what's inside. Too many adventurers have died because of unexpected dangers. That's why we need a slave to act as bait." A woman in a black hoodie nodded in agreement. "We need someone to draw attention away from us if we need to run." "It's a solid plan," she said. The group arrived at the Gaffer Merchant Union's slave market. Inside a cell, two slaves sat quietly, their expressions void of hope. The slave merchant greeted them with a slick smile. "Welcome. This market specializes in bait slaves," he said, gesturing to the captives. "Feel free to choose whoever you like. These two are in great shape," he continued, proudly introducing them. "They're fresh stock, perfect for what you need." After some discussion, the group decided to buy both slaves. Standing before a gate, Walker took out a knife and marked a wooden pillar nearby. "This will let others know we were here first," he explained. "Is everyone ready?" he asked, looking back at the team. The group, filled with excitement and anticipation, nodded. Together, they stepped into the portal and were transported to a vast, jungle-like realm. Raymond, walking through a gate for the first time, felt strange yet exhilarated. The jungle was breathtaking, with towering trees and an otherworldly atmosphere. "I've never seen anything like this before," he said, awestruck. "It's so different from what I imagined." Walker brought him back to reality. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned. "Gates usually form away from monster habitats, so we should be safe for now. But remember, we can't exit the same way we came in. We'll need to find the exit gate." As Walker spoke, a hairy green monster emerged behind the woman in the black hoodie. She noticed it too late. The creature lunged forward, grabbing her and swallowing her whole. "Charlotte!" The group screamed in panic. Before they could react, they realized they were surrounded. An army of monstrous creatures closed in on them, their grotesque forms materializing from the jungle's shadows. Walker, panicking, fired a flaming arrow at one of the beasts. "Something's wrong," he shouted. "Tie the slaves to the trees. We need to get out of here." The slaves begged for mercy, pleading to be taken along. Taryn silenced one of them with a knife to the throat. "Shut up and do what you're told," he snapped. Raymond, hesitating but desperate, tied the slaves to the trees. As the group fled, the slaves screamed after them, begging not to be left behind. One of the monsters began feasting on a slave while the other stood frozen in fear, clutching a spear. Lost in thought, he didn't notice another beast creeping up behind him until it was too late. Meanwhile, the group ran through the jungle, fear etched on their faces. Walker, carrying an injured teammate, shouted, "This gate isn't worth it. We need to leave." Raymond, overwhelmed by panic, began to break down. Taryn grabbed him by the collar. "Snap out of it," he yelled. "We failed this one, but we can prepare for the next. Focus on surviving." Before he could say more, a monster appeared and struck Terran with devastating force, crushing him instantly. Raymond was thrown back from the impact, and Terran's lifeless body was devoured. "Terran!" Walker screamed in despair. Fueled by anger, he fired another arrow, but the monster lashed out with its tongue, grabbing Walker by the neck. He was dragged into its sharp jaws and devoured, blood spraying everywhere. Raymond, frozen in terror, tripped and fell. A monster loomed over him, biting into his leg. He screamed in agony and begged for help. Spotting the slave in the distance, Raymond cried out, "Please, save me." Tears streamed down his face as he apologized for what he had done earlier. "I didn't mean it," he sobbed. "Please, we can't survive alone. Help me." The slave, silent and unmoving, watched from a tree. Raymond's desperation turned to anger. "Stop standing there and help me," he shouted. The slave finally jumped down with his spear. "It's too late," he said coldly. Raymond was already halfway inside the monster's jaws, his body trembling as he stared down at the pool of blood beneath him. His reflection stared back, a shattered, blood-smeared version of himself, and for a moment, he wondered if this was some twisted dream. But no, the pain was real, the terror suffocating. He let out a choked, bitter laugh, his mind snapping like a brittle twig under pressure. His gaze shifted to the slave who had led him to this fate, and rage burned through his despair. "You think you're walking out of here alive?" he snarled, his voice a mix of venom and tears. "You're next, you coward." The monster's jaws widened, its teeth glinting like daggers in the dim light. With one horrific snap, Raymond's scream was cut short. Blood sprayed as his arms were ripped clean off, torn from his body like paper. The sound of crunching bones and tearing flesh filled the air, a gruesome symphony marking the end of his hope. Now face to face with the monster, the slave stood firm. The beast lunged at him with terrifying speed, but the slave didn't flinch. He drove his spear into the creature's stomach, killing it instantly. Breathing heavily, he looked around the carnage and muttered, "I won't die here." The story transitions to a glimpse of our protagonist's past. On a cliff, 5 figures stand at the edge, staring at the horizon. Among them, a female knight warns that something is approaching. A dragon accompanied by its leader, ready for battle. Suddenly, the Dragon King, Gornthale, appears, his presence overshadowing everything. The knight explains that their last stronghold, the Centaur's Nest, has fallen, and no allies remain. She reveals that the Signal Knights, the Resistance, the Cross Hunters, and even the 6 legendary heroes, the last hope of humanity, are all dead. The only adventurer left is Elpam, the protagonist. The group steels themselves for a final stand. As the dragon charges, flames engulf the forest. Elpam, bloodied and exhausted, collapses to his knees. His comrades lie defeated. In front of him lay the severed head of one of the Dragon Kings. As he wondered if this marked the end for him, he looked upward. There, soaring in the sky, was the Dragon King with 2 heads, one of which he had successfully severed. One head decapitated but regenerating rapidly. Despair takes hold as Elpam realizes their efforts were in vain. The Dragon King dives, ready to deliver the final blow. Accepting his fate, Elpam closes his eyes, mourning the sacrifices of his comrades. He collapsed to the ground in defeat, his thoughts consumed by the end of the world and their journey. Suddenly, he punches his fist into the ground, overcome with anger and rage. Gritting his teeth in frustration, he asks himself, is this really how it all ends? Philip was bisected by the dragon's tail. Jaden fell fatally wounded, and Alexis shielded Elpam, taking a fatal blow in his stead. Their sacrifices haunt him as he screams in anguish, refusing to accept this grim reality. Summoning his remaining strength, he fixes an intense gaze on the Dragon King, calling out his name, Gornthale. Refusing to accept this as the end, our protagonist gathers every ounce of strength he has left, readying himself for one final, decisive strike. Power surges through him as he charges up his ultimate attack. With unwavering resolve, he declares that no matter what, he will defeat Gorntahil. Then, all of a sudden, his injuries overwhelm him, and he falters, blood spilling from his wounds. The Dragon King unleashes a devastating flame, consuming him. As he loses consciousness, Elpam curses his powerlessness, wishing for another chance. All of a sudden, a splash of cold water jolted him awake, and a voice barked at him to get up. Startled, his eyes shot open in shock, confusion clouding his thoughts. He found himself shackled and sitting on the ground, staring up at a gruff, bald man yelling at him to stop faking sickness as if that trick would work. Still disoriented, he glanced around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. His mind reeled as memories of the Dragon King, Gorntahil, clashed with the harsh reality before him. The bald man sneered, calling him a slave and ordering him to know his place. The words hit him like a thunderbolt. He was alive, and yet this wasn't the world he had just fought to save. Looking around, he recognized the grim setting of a slave market. His breathing grew heavy as realization sank in. The slave market system had been abolished long ago, but everything around him screamed its undeniable presence. The bald slave merchant kept berating him, but his mind raced with another shocking thought. This man was the same vile merchant who had lorded over him 6 years ago when he was a slave. The bald man, irritated by his lack of attention, bellowed in rage, "What the hell are you glaring at?" before landing a hard punch on his face. Pain shot through him, and as blood dripped from his bruised mouth, the thought struck him. If this were a dream, it felt far too real. Nearby, a group of adventurers led by Walker spoke with another merchant. The merchant explained casually that the slaves here were used as bait and that Walker could take his pick. Walker examined the group and agreed to take 2 of them, his tone indifferent. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked at them with newfound determination. There was no time for hesitation or overthinking. This was his second chance. A chance to rewrite his destiny. Back in the present, he picks up a staff from the ground, examining it carefully. He recognizes it as the fire arrow staff and considers its skill useful for his current level. Equipping it, he acknowledges that it's a decent start but ponders that an adventurer needs more than just a weapon. As he wanders, his eyes fall on a bloodied boot belonging to a fallen adventurer. Suspecting it might contain hidden valuables, he checks inside and discovers a ring. Upon equipping it, he realizes it's a telekinesis ring. Before he can fully process his find, a horde of monsters appears, drawn by the scent of blood from the corpses. One monster charges at him, and soon the entire horde follows. Reacting swiftly, he strikes down the first monster with his staff, but another lunges at him, its long tongue wrapping around his weapon. With terrifying strength, the monster snaps the staff in half, leaving him momentarily stunned. In his shock, a second monster closes in from behind, ready to bite. Quickly, he activates the fire arrow skill, dodging the attack and shooting an arrow straight through the monster's stomach, killing it instantly. Realizing he needs to control the chaos, he uses the telekinesis ring to manipulate the fire arrows, directing them to eliminate the surrounding monsters. Although effective, he knows he can't sustain this strategy for long. As the corpses of burning monsters litter the ground, another wave prepares to attack. He braces himself, but panic strikes when he realizes the fire arrow skill has stopped working. The staff isn't broken, it's on cooldown. Left with no other choice, he grips the staff tightly and charges forward, using it as a blunt weapon. Smashing a monster's face repeatedly, he follows up with a powerful kick, sending it crashing to the ground. He anxiously checks the staff, praying for the cooldown to end. Just as the monsters charge again, flames ignite on the staff, signaling the skill's readiness. With renewed determination, he unleashes another fire arrow and uses the ring's telekinesis ability to guide the attack, wiping out the remaining monsters. He stands amidst the burning remains, his breathing heavy but victorious. A faint voice calls out to him. Turning, he sees a bloodied adventurer, a woman from the earlier group, crawling toward him. She stares at him with a mix of shock and awe, exclaiming that he's no ordinary slave. The protagonist freezes, surprised she survived. Lying on the ground, she demands to know who he is. "How can a mere slave wield a spear and use magic?" she asks, her voice filled with anger and disbelief. Pointing to his staff and ring, she accuses him of orchestrating everything. "Was this all your plan from the start?" He looks down at her silently before asking if she's finished talking, catching her off guard. Apologizing for the confusion, he clarifies, "You've got it all wrong. Even if I had planned this, nothing would have changed. I would have killed all of you regardless." His cold words leave her trembling in shock and terror. Raising the staff, he points it at her, his voice filled with disdain. "I despise people like you who use slaves as bait." The scene shifts to a bustling city. Two onlookers gape in disbelief, nudging each other as a lone figure walks past them. It's the protagonist, now free of the battlefield. Whispers spread among the crowd. How could a slave bait return alive on his own? Unbothered by their stares, he focuses on his next goal. Standing before what appears to be a guild, he clenches his fists and resolves silently, "I need to free myself from this life as a slave, no matter what it takes." Outside the guild hall, a man with a cigar named Abby's asks the silver-haired man if the slave had returned alive. The silver-haired man confirmed, stating that it appeared so, and added that the slave had come back without a single scratch. Abby's shrugged it off, remarking that it wasn't unusual for someone meant to be bait to survive and return unharmed. However, the silver-haired man revealed that all the other adventurers who had entered the dungeon with the slave had died. Abby's, surprised, asked if the slave was the sole survivor. He found it strange, especially since the slave hadn't fled and had returned voluntarily. He explained that slaves burdened with debt usually served as disposable bait and, even if they survived, they often tried to escape. Yet, this slave hadn't run away, indicating he was fully aware of the merchant union's grip on him, where the only escape was through death. With a serious tone, Abby's acknowledged this as the way of the Graffer Merchant Union. He then questioned why he needed to be informed of such a minor matter. The silver-haired man replied that there was something else worth reporting. The slave had unlocked the first circle. This revelation left Abby stunned. He muttered that it was unheard of for a mere bait slave to achieve such a feat concerned. He thought to himself that a slave might harbor resentment toward the merchant union, which could lead to complications. Before he could dwell on it further, the silver-haired man interrupted, revealing that the slave had requested a change in his contract to register as an adventurer. Abby's was taken aback and furious at the audacity of a lowly slave to make such a request. He called it presumptuous, but before he could rage further, he was informed that Mr. Racken had personally ordered him to investigate the matter. This news pushed Abby's over the edge, and he slammed his hands on his desk in frustration. In disbelief, he pondered why a high-ranking executive of the Graffer Merchant Union would take an interest in a mere slave. His gaze fell on a book, and a thought crossed his mind. Was it related to that? Lost in thought, he stared out the window, grappling with the idea of a slave meant for bait daring to dream of becoming an adventurer. The story reveals a harsh truth. Though the Queen's Cygnus declares that slavery shall not exist, such declarations are superficial at best. In reality, humans remain slaves to Meso, the currency of the realm. Those unable to repay their debts are forced to compensate through labor, a cruel system designed by the so-called free society of the Maple World. For the protagonist, this system became a grim reality when his father, his only family, succumbed to illness. Left alone, he fell into the clutches of the Graffer Merchant Union. In a desperate attempt to save his father, he had purchased black moss from the Union on credit. However, the Union had set its price at an astronomical 1,000 meso, many times its true value. Unable to repay the debt, the protagonist, Elpam, was hauled before the court. The judge delivered the verdict. Failure to settle the debt by the due date required him to labor for the merchant union until the equivalent amount was repaid. This marked the beginning of 6 long years of exploitation as a slave under the union's control. Now, seated across from Abby's, the face of the organization that had stolen his freedom, the protagonist burned with resolve. He declared with unwavering conviction that the time for his revenge had come. The protagonist introduced himself to Abis, quietly noting that Abis was the right-hand man of Rakan, one of the Graffer Merchant Union's executives. Internally, he thought he had caught a big fish. Abis, wasting no time, asked if the protagonist wanted to modify his contract. He mentioned that he had already received the report about him and promised to keep things brief. To the protagonist's surprise, Abis agreed to change the contract, offering to make him an F-rank adventurer. The protagonist was taken aback by how easily Abis accepted the demand. Suspicious of Abis's motives, he thanked him but immediately escalated the negotiation, requesting an E-rank instead. Internally, the protagonist resolved not to let Abis control the conversation. Abis questioned the bold demand, pointing out that the Adventurer Association hadn't even assigned the protagonist a rank yet. Calmly, the protagonist countered, claiming his experience from surviving hundreds of gates over the past 3 years as a bait slave. Abis dismissed this, pointing out that as bait, he had never actively hunted monsters. The protagonist responded that the first adventurer to gain fame did so by surviving, not by hunting. He argued that survival, not killing, was the true virtue of an adventurer. This argument made Abis pause, as he considered that information brought back by survivors could sometimes outweigh individual accomplishments. Acknowledging this logic, Abis admitted that surviving as a bait slave for 3 years was indeed remarkable. However, he quickly added that the protagonist's experience was limited to low-difficulty dungeons. He questioned whether the same pathetic survival skills would work in higher-ranked gates. Lighting a cigar, Abis warned the protagonist not to take the Union for fools who would offer risky contracts to someone likely to die before repaying their debt. As he studied the protagonist, he felt an unsettling, almost repulsive energy radiating from him. Changing tactics, Abis mentioned a notorious gate with a 12-scar ranking, one that had claimed the lives of numerous adventurers, leaving behind the bones of at least 12 parties. This intrigued the protagonist, and Abis confirmed the challenge with enthusiasm, daring him to prove his worth by surviving such a gate. With a menacing pride, Abis handed the contract to the protagonist, declaring that if he could survive the challenge, Abis would grant him what he wanted. The negotiation concluded. The protagonist knew the stakes had just been raised. The scene shifts to a dense forest, where the protagonist stands before a group of 4 adventurers. An orange-haired man steps forward and sizes him up, asking if he's the rookie joining their mission. Introducing himself as Shev, the tank of the group, he mentions hearing about the protagonist from Abis and acknowledges his past as a bait slave. Shev reassures him, saying he doesn't care about his history, and neither do his teammates. With a welcoming smile, he expresses hope that they'll work well together. One of the members comments, "I heard you can use fire magic." The protagonist confirms it, prompting a silver-haired teammate to question him further. "What do you mean? Can you only use fire magic? Isn't the element a mage uses predetermined?" Shev chimes in, explaining that mages are usually restricted to the elemental affinity they're born with, and items unrelated to their element are useless to them. Turning to another teammate, he asks if they've heard the same. The teammate shrugs, admitting it's too complicated for him to understand. Shifting the conversation back to the mission, Shev announces it's time to focus. "You must have already heard, but this mission isn't about hunting monsters," he explains. Their goal is to safely retrieve items left behind by the 12 adventure parties who perished before them. Shev adds that the Union is offering 3,000 meso for each recovered item. The silver-haired adventurer grumbles, "Isn't that way too little? If we don't retrieve anything, we get nothing. And items meant for first circle adventurers are worth at least 7,000 meso or more. That's less than half their real value." A teammate tells him to stop complaining, but the tension lingers. Shev steps in, calling for an end to the bickering. He turns to the group, asking, "Is everyone ready to enter the gate?" With the team now prepared, the mission to retrieve the lost items. Inside the gate, the atmosphere was unsettling despite the brightness. The silver-haired adventurer remarked on how the place felt dreary. Shev, taking charge, instructed everyone to focus, emphasizing the likelihood of a long battle in the dense forest. He suggested setting up a base first. One of the group members pointed to a large tree, noting its thick branches would make hiding and moving between trees easier. Shev approved and gave the go-ahead. As the group worked, one member pulled out a bag of nails and rope, jokingly telling the protagonist to relax since setting up the base was a job for him and his idiot friends. After some time, they completed a secure base high in the tree. Shev then divided the group into two teams. Tom, Max, and Roa formed the first team to scout the east, while Shev and the protagonist would explore the west. He reminded everyone to signal and return to the base if anything happened. As Shev and the protagonist walked through the forest, Shev wondered aloud why they hadn't encountered a single monster or item yet. He speculated that they might have set their base too early and suggested they move further in the next day. Turning to the protagonist, he asked how his first mission as an adventurer felt. The protagonist admitted to feeling nervous, which Shev laughed off, saying that was normal. Shev opened up about his own nerves, admitting he'd been an adventurer for years, yet still felt scared every time he entered a gate. However, he credited his courage to the support of his team, describing them as truly good people. Shev then expressed sympathy for the protagonist's past as a bait slave and tentatively offered him a spot in their group. Before he could finish, the protagonist's attention was caught by something on the ground, a footprint. Shev dismissed his earlier suggestion as a joke and urged him not to worry about it. Later that evening, the group gathered around a campfire, sharing food and chatting. Shev told them to stop talking about work while eating, promising they could discuss it tomorrow. The protagonist remained quiet, sipping water and observing. That night, as the protagonist lay asleep, a figure approached him, torchlight flickering in the darkness. It was Shev who called out to him, "Oi, Palm." His tone was serious, but the protagonist remained unresponsive, seemingly deep in sleep. Another voice interrupted, asking him, "What are you doing?" It was Max, stepping out with a sinister grin and a knife in hand. "He is caution. He's fast asleep," Max sneered. "How would he answer you?" The rest of the group gathered around the sleeping protagonist, their intentions clear. One of them chuckled, reminding Max about the substance they'd mixed into the protagonist's food. He downed so much of it, he'd be lucky not to die, they joked. Another remarked on the fire arrow wand the protagonist carried, estimating its worth at 10,000 meso. Max, his knife gleaming in the firelight, smirked menacingly. "Then let's get to work, shall we?" he said, preparing to strike. This is the end of this video. If you guys enjoy the recap, please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe and turn on the notifications so you won't miss any updates from my channel.